Hey folks, welcome into the BN Cubs Podcast, episode 2. I might do that every time. I don't know. You'll have to remind me, Michael, if we get up into the higher numbers. It's easy to forget. This, of course, is the Bleacher Nation Cubs Podcast, brought to you by Ankin Law. Got a shouts to our sponsor at the top. Appreciate them letting us do this. Make sure you check out Howard Ankin and his firm for your legal needs, and check out Bleacher Nation for your Cubs, Bears, Bulls, Blackhawks, other sports needs. So let's get into some Cubs stuff here on the pod. Obviously, spring training still underway, and I'm partly going to kick this to you, Michael, because you wrote something recently that resonated, I think, with a lot of folks about spring training in general. And I couldn't tell what was driving it, but like to put words in your mouth, the idea was sort of built around, we used to. Again, you can define we however you want, but we used to really be into spring training games. Like when you could watch one, it was like it was just so much fun to be able to see, and you could attribute that to a lot of things that I think you'll get into. And for whatever reason, last couple of years, it has felt less that way. Like I still follow the spring games like usual, but it doesn't. I don't know. I feel very focused on the regular season to the exclusion of like really caring at all about spring training stuff. And so now I will kick it to you to kind of get into what you talked about, and then any other thoughts that you have on that. Because I wonder if it's resonating with other folks too.
Yeah. So, I mean, spring training was always exciting, but even at the height, after maybe 2 weeks, you were kind of like, okay,
I can tell you the height. Can I tell you the height?
Yeah.
It was when it was Jorge Soler, Javi Baez, and Chris Bryant went back to back off of Trevor Bauer in 2015 spring training. Maybe I might have the years wrong. And
but there was
the
more,
pinnacle of like spring training. Yes.
Do you remember that year that Ian Happ hit like 10 spring training home runs? Yeah. Do you remember that? That was actually, it was leading into his first home run of the season that I jumped in the lake for.
The pitch
he hit
one.
Like 10, it was just, anyway, that's all besides the point. I was always like really geared up for spring training, and then sure, it would fall off eventually. But this year after the first game, I was barely even excited anymore. And I was like, what changed? Like, why am I so eager to get to the regular season? And I kind of came up with two explanations. And one is, a lot of these spring training games are televised. Now, this year, Marquee went from 27 last year to 17. So there is a lot fewer, but we used to have like 5, maybe at most. So it was like, whoa, we get to get eyes on baseball. This is awesome. I'm so excited. But the bigger one, the thing that I think is really driving my lack of enthusiasm for spring training this year or recently, is that this used to be pretty much the only opportunity we had to get our eyes on the Cubs' top prospects. And so it was like, man, I cannot wait to see Moises Ballesteros or Kevin Alcantara or whoever is playing, because this is my only chance to really actually watch them play, unless you go to Iowa, you go to South Bend, you go to Tennessee, whatever. But now most of those games are televised throughout the season. And it's not like I'm watching a ton of minor league baseball, but I'll put those games on and watch, and I get to see them all the time. And there's highlights for every level like crazy. And there's more statistics for every level, including at AAA StatCast information. So it's like, I no longer have, it's not that I have nothing to learn about these guys. I've obviously watched them way less than the big league players, but I'm familiar with their game. I've seen them play a lot. And so it's just kind of like, I'm just like, okay, let's get through this. It's not even, it's one thing to have to watch the Bruhans and the Birdies and the Workmans of the world, but at least that used to be balanced out with guys that you're desperate to see. And now it's like, well, I know I'm going to get to see them all year. Like, this is not the last opportunity. So I kind of just feel not empty, but I'm like, okay, spring training, like, come on, let's get through it. Let's get to the regular season. It just doesn't have the same juice it used to have.
Yeah. And that's, I'm sure why that was the first thought that came to mind, was that the 3 home runs off of Trevor Bauer, because those were 3 tip-top prospects in the system at the height of when we were paying attention to that stuff. When I think there might have been some MILB TV broadcasts streaming, but like not many. You weren't getting highlights all the time. Certainly there were no, marquee didn't even exist. And so I think that's a good point. And I think too, this may speak a little bit more to us because we do this as our job, but once you've done this for long enough and you become familiar enough with the rhythms of spring training and of the consequences of spring training or not, it does become, you become more like a team in terms of guys are just getting ready for the season. Doesn't matter. I remember Gretchen, my wife, used to ask, Cubs win today, like spring training, right? And she got so used to every time I'd be like, it doesn't matter. She doesn't ask anymore. And so that's another thing I noticed, that we have almost absorbed that way of the team thinking about it. But I can't leave it there, right? Because then we've done an entire podcast where we're like, hey, this is a podcast about spring training. By the way, did you know that spring training doesn't matter at all? See ya. Thanks, Howard Ankin. No, there are things that are generated by spring training that merit discussion and I think can be interesting. And certainly injuries are the big one. That's why at the top of spring training every year, it's like, just stay healthy. That is the biggest thing. And by and large, the Cubs have been pretty healthy. The Javier Assad oblique injury is lingering in terms of kind of taking him off the board for opening day, both opening days. Nico Horner's rehab, Matt Shaw's oblique thing, but things are kind of looking good on that front. I wouldn't say injuries have been a big storyline for the Cubs this spring, and that's a good thing. And I would add, when it comes to your established veterans, all you're looking for from them is to stay healthy and get in their reps, just physically get themselves ready for the season. And so those things are important. They're the most important things really about spring training, but they're easy for us as fans to kind of throw off and not ignore, but just sort of not belabor in discourse, either in a podcast or with friends or online.
Well, so you're saying you're not concerned about Kyle Tucker's 000-167 000 line?
You're stepping on my segments. No,
let's
go. No, you're good. Because let's go right there. So what I was thinking we would talk about is some specific players and their performances this spring. But I'm telling you folks in advance, don't take too much from this, because the idea is more to talk about categories of players than it is about specific players. Kyle Tucker is a perfect example of a category of not just player, but like circumstances, right? So what Michael's referencing is he's still hitless. Kyle Tucker, superstar. Cubs paid through the nose to acquire him. We see Cam Smith highlights every day from spring as he's facing, by the way, like guys who aren't going to make a roster, who are like edge of spring training, whatever. Good for him. I have no problem with him doing well. But Kyle Tucker, hitless, is not performing this spring. And question for you, Michael, is does anything that has happened with him this spring change your expectations or, give you concerns or pause or any impact whatsoever for what his regular season is going to be that weren't already there, have been changed by spring training?
So the answer is definitely no, but I do have like a, I don't know what kind of thought this is. It always lingers in the back of my mind. Of course not. Right? No, he's going to be fine. But would I prefer if he was 14 for 14 instead of 0 for 14? Kind of in a weird way. Yeah. Even though I know that doesn't make a difference. Like, sure, him performing poorly isn't going to change my outlook for the season. That's an absurd thing to say. It's like, and also it's like, it would be cool if he had a bunch of hits, because maybe I could convince myself that he's already locked in or not even working on something. But like, the answer is no, and he will be fine, because we've learned that 1,000 times over. And it goes more so for players like him, obviously. And I honestly, in a lot of ways, I think the opposite and I don't want to get into the next category of player, but like I'll use an older player as an example. There's a reason why David Bodie had amazing springs every year, probably because he wasn't working on anything and was solely trying to produce as much as humanly possible so that he can make the team. Kyle Tucker has absolutely, so for all we know, Kyle Tucker is exclusively working on fastballs in the outer third of the zone and looking for only those pitches and trying to hit only those pitches. Whereas Gage Workman is trying to make the team, and like the way he thinks he'll do that, and he might not be wrong, is by performing well right now. And so that's why it's like there's this iffy like middle ground where I'm like, it's nice. It's just would still be nice to see the good guys perform, but I'm not concerned about it. Like not even it's wrong to even say I'm not concerned about it. It's just a non-factor for Kyle Tucker.
Right. Same. You summed it up. It's that it just has no impact whatsoever. It'd be cool to see. But I remember when Jock Peterson was fresh to the Cubs and he had an absolutely monster spring. He hit a ton of homers. Regular season starts and he had like a brutal first month of the season. It just didn't matter at all. And then he turned it around. It's fine. And the Cubs traded him for a star who is assuredly still in the system.
He was, I know who it was.
It was a big, tall guy.
Yeah. Anyway. What's the nickname of what's the myth of the guy with the blue ox? Paul Bunyan. Oh. That was his nickname. That
was his nickname? Was Paul Bunyan? That's funny because he was a huge.
Not Bryce Ball.
Yeah, Bryce Ball.
Bryce Ball. Paul Bunyan.
Good pull.
Yeah, I got that one.
So Kyle Tucker just a non-factor, and I'm going to use that to go to another category that you mentioned, and indeed you. Actually, let me save Gage Workman. Separate conversation, but so. If you looked at Kyle Tucker and you said, this is concerning, then you would, if you're going to be intellectually consistent, you'd have to look at, for example, Michael Busch and his monster spring of 22 plate appearances or whatever. And you'd say, wow, he is going to be a beast in April and May. And of course, we're not doing that, right? Like, it's nice, like you said, that he's looking good. It's nice that he's hitting the ball hard. It's nice that he feels comfortable, that he's clearly healthy. But it does not suggest that he has flipped some switch from last year to this year. And indeed, if it does happen, then it isn't going to be as if spring training was the harbinger of joy and performance boon for Michael Busch. It was that he developed. He got a full year in the big leagues last year, and he's a very good hitter. And he was able to continue and carry that forward. And so that I think of those two structural situations the same way. When you've got guys who know they have their job, Busch is a little bit more in development mode than Tucker. They're the same age, by the way. Isn't that funny? We don't think about
I didn't realize that. I thought he was a year younger, maybe.
I think it might be 6 months or something. So, but generally speaking, those are the ones that fall for my mind very quickly. And in fact, virtually all the starting pitchers fall into this category where we're not even, if you have thoughts.
Perhaps even more so for the pitchers, in my opinion.
You just don't, especially because they're the ones who control what they're working on so completely. So there's a reason teams send half their starters to go to the backfields and throw simulated games because it's just does not matter. They're just trying to get their arms strengthened, their pitch count built up. They might be tweaking some pitch shapes. They might be making sure some offseason changes are locked in. They might be like, I just really want to hammer the change up today. And they throw it in counts that they would never throw it in, so on and so forth. And so you just don't take anything from that. That said, I do think there are some categories of performances and players where it is worth paying attention to. Okay. One of which I wrote about in the bullets today at Bleacher Nation, and that's a reliever like Tyson Miller. Tyson Miller, former Cubs prospect, who then ended up getting bounced from the 40-man because he just couldn't quite get over the hump, went to a few places, and then ended up back with the Cubs early last season when he was squeezed off the Mariners' very pitching-dense 40-man. And he was brilliant for the Cubs last year. He kind of has reinvented himself as this sidearm reliever, low velocity, very Scott Effross-like, and he was fantastic. And so you certainly regard that performance as more important in projecting him than his spring would be. But you're not talking about a completely established veteran who has this very long track record where he's like going to get into his rhythms. It's going to be fine. You're also talking about a guy who's kind of at the margins of velocity related success. He's not a hard throwing guy. And so his margins for error are a little bit slimmer. He's going to need to be a little bit more precise, feeling really good. And he's a guy who's out of options. There's a roster crunch. There's a bullpen crunch. And so you do have to regard his performance in spring, not necessarily the results, but like how he looks, how it looks like he's pitching. You have to look at those things a little bit closer because you might have to make decisions where, okay, relievers are volatile. He was great last year, but not so much before that. Now he looks like this. And you're going to have to make those decisions that are right there on the edges of a roster. And I think that that's when spring results aren't determinative, but the way a guy looks is going to factor into some decisions.
Yeah. Well, so have you noticed, specifically on Tyson Miller, but Craig Counsell has been, I've been reading a lot of his, quotes recently, a lot of great stuff out of spring training. I keep noticing this unifying thread from multiple days on multiple players where he notes that was a quote unquote, like one of his goals this spring. Have you seen this language at all? He keeps talking about goal specific objectives for individual players. Like, oh, that's not a goal of his. This is a goal of his. That's not a goal of his. This is a goal of his. So they mention that a lot. And so in my mind, I'm like, you know what? If I knew everybody's goal, I would be able to watch the spring with a discerning eye, knowing what they're going for. And instead I can't because we don't have that insight. But when it comes to someone like Tyson Miller, I mean, you cannot, I find it hard to believe that his goal is not to perform well right now. And I mean, you know what I mean? Like it's not like, I need an updated, not analogy, but a story, because I've used this one a bunch in the past, but I remember when Jose Quintana was on the Cubs, he talked about one spring game where he threw 20 out of 20 changeups in his outing because that's what he was working on. And that's not what Tyson Miller's doing, I don't think. You know what I mean? And I mean that as a logic leap, like he's not doing that.
His one of his appearances, he threw something like 13 straight balls to open the appearance. Well, he's not working on that. I mean, there's nothing that a guy could be working on that would not involve at least throwing some strikes. And so, that stood out to me on him in particular, because he does have this funky delivery. His success is so reliant on executing. He has to be a pitchability guy. Like he has to execute at a very high level to have success. And so you see the wildness, and there is a little bit of like okay, hopefully that's just, and I think he's going to have the benefit of the doubt. If we were talking about Miller, like specifically, it's like, he's going to have the benefit of the doubt a bit because of the roster situation. Like, I don't think the front office, and I don't think Craig Counsell, they're not going to want to lose guys if they don't have to. And so I do think anybody who's got options remaining, and Craig Counsell has basically said this.
It sucks how right you are about that. I mean, it comes up all the time. And it's something you've hammered a lot is like the value of any reliever that has options to be shuttled up and down throughout the years. Like it's like extra value to the team. Like you need to bake that in to the this guy or this guy conversation, which kind of stinks because I think in in certain scenarios, you could end up with someone who's maybe less good, but you need to keep them to see. And that's maybe what makes a GM a good GM a good GM, or a good president a good president, is correctly scouting those players, but identifying which guys are the right guys to cut bait from and when. And relievers is like the number one, the biggest opportunity for that. The bench too, but I think they have a little less impact.
The Cubs, not to diverge too far, but like the Cubs of the last 10 years, we talk about this a lot, that by the end of the year, they usually have a really good bullpen. Like that's been a hallmark of the Theo Jed era. They figure it out. Different managers, different coaching staffs, certainly different relievers, but that generally is a hallmark. The part that they've not been great about is having established, locked in guys from day one who are in key roles and performing from day one. That has mostly, to my view, been the product of two things. One, they haven't developed relievers very well until the last 3 years. And then 2, they don't invest in that. How much ink got spilled on them finally going after Tanner Scott this offseason. Like, it's just not an area where they
put Hector Neris last year. It was like a big deal that they signed Hector Neris. Like, that was a 1 year plus option deal.
And so I think the thing that they have then not done super well is knowing exactly when to cut bait on the guys that you're talking about, where it's like, okay, got to hang on to this guy so we can make sure he's not going to work. Like, Tyson Miller might end up being this guy. Like, it was Jose Cuas last year, where it's like, I remember he was that 8th, 9th pitcher, and it's sort of like, you don't want to lose him. They decide to go with him, and his spring struggles carried over, and he really struggled. This parrot, gosh, this is hitting me as I'm saying it. He was also like a side arming guy who was heavily reliant on execution to succeed. And he was also a guy the Cubs had picked up on the cheap at midseason, and he performed after that. And hopefully parallels don't play.
You're exactly right about the side arming thing too, because the exact way they succeed is their kryptonite. If it doesn't work, there's not like there's a low floor and a high ceiling. So it quickly slides down. Before we shift into the game part of the pod, I do just want to talk about.
I still have another. Sorry, I do have 2 more categories that we can hit relatively quickly.
Let's hit them. No, do it.
So one is, I like to watch guys like Brad Keller, who's a reclamation project type, who has suddenly added 3 or 4 miles per hour to his fastball, and it's sort of like, his spring performance matters a lot because the Cubs have to make a roster decision on him because he has an opt-out. And so, like, the only thing they have, because he's transformed himself a bit, is, okay, what is he now? So you really have to judge that very closely. Results aren't necessarily the thing. It's, again, how does he look in game? Mm-hmm. He's given up some home runs that have skewed his results, but, like, I don't know if you've been watching, but, like, he looks nasty. Like, every pitch is like, I forget, it's 3 or 4 pitches that are, all of them are looking really good. So I tend to think the Cubs are going to try to figure out a way to keep him. And then similarly, Gage Workman, who you mentioned earlier, performing excellently. He's not just feasting on those back end pitchers in spring. He's getting starts and generally has been playing early and facing, real pitchers, but it's spring results, and he's focused on performing and getting results. And the Cubs have to make a decision on him because he's a Rule 5 pick, which means he either makes the team or they've got to offer him back to the Tigers, who I just feel like there's no way they don't pay $50,000 to get him back, because they get him back as just a true minor leaguer. The Cubs don't have that option. The Cubs have to keep him on the big league roster if they're going to keep him. So he's another one that you just watch that performance a little more closely because you don't have a history off of which to judge. And you're just trying to decide, can this guy help us right now? That was it. Those are sort of the categories.
No, yeah. I mean, well, I was going to say I wasn't going to say this as a category, but there is another category, and it's prospects. But for them, it kind of nothing really matters if they're not like a threat.
But you can notice, no, that's a good point, because you can notice developments, off-season development.
Right.
Sometimes it's just physical. Like, a guy shows up and you're like, oh, he finally got big. Yeah.
Speaking of getting big, the opposite. I'm going to transition.
Reportedly the opposite is true.
Yes. Moises Ballesteros is probably the guy I wanted to get eyes on the most, but not for his bat, because I am just a absolute full on 100% believer in his ability to hit. Like, I think he's going to be a hitter. Catching was the thing. And I just want to read you this quote from Craig Counsell on his catching. And I want to see if you kind of had the same reaction as I did, because I was like, okay. Experience. This is the quote from Craig Counsell on Moises Ballesteros. Experience catching is a real goal for him. There's that line. And in the drill work, exposure to good players, that was the goal. He's not a finished product catching, so we just wanted him to keep taking strides. And a lot of it is just receiving work. He has very good instincts for the game. So that part of it, he's very capable. It's not a developmental goal. That part he will be very good at. So just before you respond, the emphasis on the part of the game that he's good at being the thing that none of us can have any visibility into felt a whole lot like I'm going to throw him a complimentary bone because the rest of it is a very much work in progress. That was not a glowing review of his catching ability, which we know is the thing. But like, I almost wanted to throw away that second part. It was like, okay, maybe he's good at that. Maybe he's a 21-year-old catcher. How good at the game calling part of it is he? Is he a baseball savant? Like, give me a break. He's probably not that good at that. That is like the one thing that you need time to get good at. It's like, that's the experience part. So I'm not super optimistic about that angle. And like, I think like his whole ability to catch and whether he's going to do it. I mean, and also like he has like a really small setup behind the plate. He's like very compact. And I was just like, I don't know much. I'm not a catching scout. And I know there's a million things that could go into that I'm not like super impressed by that part. And I think that's worth talking about briefly, at least.
Yeah. It's funny. I did see that quote. And I'm apparently the sucker out of the two of us, because I saw that and I was like, oh, good. He's got that part of the game down. Great.
It's like, so, but how do you know?
Yeah, you can't know. You can't know. And you do, sometimes you get quotes from pitchers that come up through the system and they're like, oh man, I loved working with that guy. And da, 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 da. And I've never heard anything negative on that side, from pitchers, but I don't know that I've heard the same, like when Miguel Amaya was coming up and a lot of the same guys worked with him a lot of time at the levels. That was a lot of the praise that pitchers really liked working with him. And again, I'm not saying that that's not also true of Moises Ballesteros. I'm just saying, I don't know that I've heard that quite as much. But that I could give a partial excuse that he's so young. He is so young that, guys at 21, he just turned 21. Okay. Typically catcher development trajectory, especially in the catching part of the game, you'd be at like low A, high A, maybe.
Oh, for sure.
Not spending half seasons at upper levels of the minors where the stuff is nastier, where the pitchers are in a different stage developmentally of their career, and they have different, not expectations, but they have different needs from the catchers, right? So it might just be completely unfair to regard Ballesteros that way, like that we would for typical catching.
But it's also the reality of what we're approaching, because like, okay, it's not unreasonable at all for a catching prospect to debut at 25 and that be young, but he's 21 or whatever, and he's at AAA, so he's not spending 4 more years there. So it's like, like what are they exactly going to do? And more to your point, anytime any player, especially players, is asked about another player, it's only ever good things. No one ever says anything bad ever. And a manager might even be
sucks.
Yeah, exactly.
Fucking hate throwing to that guy.
Did throw like he was like, yeah, he's not there developmentally as a receiving catcher.
Yeah.
Like,
and like we know,
it was not good.
I did. Yeah, it would have been jarring if he was like, man, he turned the corner and he's like, he's a perfect receiver and he's all these things. I mean, I think the catching guru that they brought in, Jerry Weinstein, in the offseason, I'm not saying it was exclusively to work with Ballesteros, but like, you go to his feed and check out a lot of the clips. It's a lot of him working with Ballesteros on sort of building back up some fundamentals of receiving and the, blocking, throwing, just a lot of that, the real basic stuff that hopefully we do see some development from Ballesteros. Now, be careful, everyone. A lot of times what's so difficult for catchers and why we see so few monster offensive catchers who are also good at catching is because it takes so much of your time and energy and focus and studying and reps to be good at one side. And it's very hard to do both at the same time, particularly for a 21-year-old who's already playing against pitchers 5 years older than he is. So, all right, we good? We're good.
Yeah.
All right. Game me. So we mentioned.
Well, let's take a pause and say thanks to Incan Law, Howard Incan and Incan Law. They're our sponsor for the podcast. The Bleacher Nation Cubs podcast is only possible because of them. I should have written this down so I had something to say about Howard Incan, like in their copy, but I didn't. I'll do that next time. We love you guys though. And again, everyone out there listening to this is all made possible because of them. So thank you again to Incan Law. As we transition to the game, well, we're going to have to get a game bell sound effect, like
the
ding
game.
Yeah.
Well, because so as we mentioned last week, this is something we're going to try to do at the end of every episode is each of us will spring upon the other some kind of game for which minimal heads up, like at most. So I don't exactly know where Michael is going with this today. He's going to drop something on me. So please forgive me if I am, embarrassing throughout this.
No, you won't. This one. So like last week I had to try to come up with the starting lineup for the Cubs' first spring training game in 2016. This is not going to be quizzing. We're going to do a blind ranking today. Okay. So I think you're familiar with the concept. I'm going to give you 5 things. You have to put them, 1 being the best, 5 being they're all good things, but I want to get your frame of reference. But Brett won't know what's coming next. So he has to, that's the blind part of the blind ranking, he has to sort of strategically place his answers in the correct place. And we'll see where he ends up at the end, because I think it'll be pretty funny. So what you will be blind ranking are 5 Cubs trades in history. And you could go any way you want with it, but it's not just like, oh, this was the best value trade. It's going to be like, best for the team, for the organization, for the history that you liked. Anything, just this was the best trade that happened. Got it? Okay. Yep. And there's going to be some fun surprises along the way. Okay. I'm going to read a little quote of each trade before that you said, which is funny. They're mostly good. So before the first trade, this is what you said. A singular top 100 prospect probably would have made me a little happier today, but that doesn't mean I'm right or that a top 100 prospect was even going to be possible. This trade was the Cubs acquiring Jake Arrieta and Pedro Strop for Scott Feldman and Steve Clevenger. So son of a bitch. Not super great, but one is, this is the best trade in Cubs history, or of the 5 I'm going to name, because there's not every trade. 5 being the lowest. Where are you placing that?
I will note at the top, I didn't dislike that trade when it happened. I remember it so vividly because I know where I was when I was writing about it. Didn't dislike it, but it just was not what I was hoping they'd target. It was this post-hype pitcher who had kind of flamed out. It seemed like he was maybe never going to put it together at the big league level, and then a decent reliever who'd had some success, but obviously proved to be one of the most consequential trades in Cubs history. So here's where I'm going to put it, because of my own, lack of vision at the time of the trade. I'm going to put that one number 3.
Okay. Arrieta and Strop is 3. This next one you said.
Now, hey, when we publish this or whatever, and Addison, our producer, I'm warning you now, don't make the list like best Cubs trades ever. And then I've got that as number 3, because people will screenshot that and I will never, ever recover.
Right. Like I saved Nick Madrigal trade for last, and you have to put it in the one slot. No, these are all good ones. So I'll give you that, so that you're going to be happy for the most part. It's going to be fun. So this one, you said, given the Cubs' long-term needs and relative depth of their pen, I can't call this anything but a win for the Cubs. This trade was Cubs acquiring Anthony Rizzo and Zach Cates for Andrew Kashner and not going to say this name correctly, Kyung-Min Na. So the Anthony Rizzo trade, basically.
And I remember why I framed it like that, because Kashner was likely to be a reliever for the Cubs. He was a hot prospect coming up for a long time. Seemed like he was not going to be able to make it go as a starting pitcher. And so I was thinking, okay, they can absorb that loss better than they could try to home grow a star first baseman. A star hitter really was the focus. And so I like that one. I like that one right away, man. I might make that number 1, because I can't immediately imagine on the time scale of a podcast. I can't immediately think of one that married both at the time thinking, oh, this is what they need. And then 2, time proved it out to be such an important move and a good trade. Kashner ended up starting. He did end up starting with the Padres, by the way. And he was decent for a few years, but his shoulder, I think, kind of gave out on him.
No, for sure. I think that's solid. Anthony Rizzo, number 1. Going to throw a little bit of a curveball for you on this one. It's not a quote from you. It's a quote from the Boston Globe. The understanding was that Boston would receive a significant return. The Red Sox asked for ace right-hander Matt Garza. They asked for young shortstop Starlin Castro, as this correspondent had proposed. Would righty Jeff Samardzija be considered significant? Or the Sox could take a chance on returning starter Andrew Kashner. This trade is Cubs acquire Theo Epstein for Chris Carpenter. Where does the Theo Epstein trade rank on your list of Cubs all-time trades?
Not that Chris Carpenter, the other one. Yeah, that's funny. I'm going to put it down on the list because we knew the Cubs were getting Epstein. We didn't really regard it as a trade at the time, even though technically it did end up being it's a true trade. And so this is another one where when people see the list, they're going to be like, what is wrong with this guy? But this is what happens with these blind rankings. I'm actually going to put that one. I'm going to put it at number 5 because
Theo Epstein, the architect of the 2016 World Series team, the worst of the 5 possible trades.
Because the trade itself. Oh, and I felt pretty hostily at the time with the idea that the Cubs had to trade for him at all.
I went and read a bunch of our stuff. I forgot a lot of the drama around it. It was a long thing. The commissioner got involved. It was it was a big
because it was a promotion. The Cubs invented, everybody's got a president of baseball operations now. The Cubs kind of invented the idea that that's a totally different role than a GM who runs baseball operations. But they did it so they could say that Theo was a promotion. And, teams, you don't hold guys back from promotions. You don't ask for trade compensation, So, yeah, 5.
And they only had 1 year of control over Theo, too.
Yes.
But the Boston Globe asking for Starlin Castro in 2011
is 2011. It's
absurd. Give me a break. Even Jeff Samardzija, or Matt Garza, who had value. Those are
Although,
crazy.
What's funny? What's funny to think about is if say that had happened, how would we look at it in hindsight? Say they had traded, let's say Samardzija. Okay, he was pretty good for the Cubs and ended up being an important trade later on. But is the trajectory of the Cubs? Maybe Samardzija's a bad example because Russell was on the team. But make it Garza. Make it Garza. Okay, we would have thought that was a crazy trade at the time. Okay, but the question is, would the Cubs' trajectory have been any different if they had traded Garza for Epstein? Probably not.
Yeah.
So it is interesting to think about that.
Okay. This one, so that was Theo at 5. So you have spot 2 and 4 left.
Okay.
This quote, it's a good risk for the Cubs. I'm typing this through gritted teeth and blurry eyes, but yes, I can't concede this is a very good baseball trade. I like this one a lot. Brett Taylor. Do you have an idea who this trade is that you liked so much?
I don't know, but I'm hoping it was during the blogathon. If I was saying I'm through blurry eyes, because then I could defend it, or the winter meetings or something.
It was a good one. Cubs acquire Pete Crow Armstrong for Javi Baez and Trevor Williams. Now, before you answer, I know PCA is not there yet, but I think we all have a pretty good vibe around him. So I wanted to include this one because that was a great trade as of we stand today.
Yeah, well, especially you look at the rest of those 2021 trades this summer, none stand remotely close to that one in terms of returned value. Kevin Alcantara is really the biggest and best hope remaining, and do love him as a prospect, but he's not where PCA is right now. So no, I like that inclusion. And I remember writing that. It was the end of the blogathon. And it was a tough one because all those trades happened bang, bang, bang. And it was like trying to sort them out. It was a upside play because what people forget is that PCA had a injured shoulder and he was out for the entire year, surgery. A lot of people didn't think his bat was going to become much of anything. They're like, the defense, it'll play, but the bat, maybe not. So it was a high risk move in that regard, and it played out very well. But I still I gotta put it at 4 just because we haven't seen it fully play out yet.
Okay. I like that. I think that's good. I also think you had a good take on that for injured prospect the Cubs passed on in the draft. Prior to. Yeah. I mean, you liked him. That was correct. I think a lot of people were like, they just traded Javi Baez for Albert Elmora Jr. That was wrong. Okay, last one. This trade, also not a quote from you because Bleacher Nation didn't exist yet. This is Cubs GM Larry Himes. Blank is an outstanding defensive player who will add speed to our ball club. We were the worst team in allowing doubles last year, and with him, that's going to change. Do you know who this is about?
Was that the Sammy Sosa trade?
Sammy Sosa.
So this defensive outfielder.
The defensive outfielder with speed, Sammy Sosa. For George Bell, Ken Patterson, and Cash. Yeah. You have one spot left. So Sammy Sosa goes 2, but do you have any thoughts on the Sammy Sosa trade as one of the most significant in Cubs history?
Well, so in terms of commenting at it at the time, so I was about 10 when that trade happened. And so if it registered to me at all, it would have been like a headline in the newspaper that I would have been like, who?
What's a newspaper?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm so young. I'm cool. I don't
look
even
at
know
this,
what paper
look at
is.
this young guy. So I wouldn't have had much thoughts in the way of that, but he did become pretty significant contributor quickly. And he didn't become Sammy Sosa for a few more years. So yeah, it's fun. We actually don't probably talk about that one enough in the pantheon of like critical Cubs trades. I guess because he was still, he had a little bit of time at the Rangers and White Sox and sort of was not, it wasn't really a true prospect trade, but it wasn't an established star. I don't know, must fall into a gap because of that. So we just always think of him as Sammy was a Cub, but he wasn't. They had to trade for him. I'm good with that being number 2.
Yeah. So your final list: Anthony Rizzo 1, Sammy Sosa 2, Arrieta and Strop 3, PCA 4, Theo 5. Would you make any changes?
I mean, I'm going to get hammered for Arrieta being 3 and Theo.
That's the one that probably could move up. I feel
yeah. I mean, that one could be moved up. The Epstein one depends on. Like I've got my reasons. I actually wouldn't.
I was trying to throw you a curveball.
That was good. It's good. I wouldn't change it, but I understand what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think you did pretty well. So yeah, that's the game for this week. And we're going to try different things every time, but that one was pretty fun because you didn't have to be put on blast for not knowing who started in center field in 2016 spring training game.
Hey, you wrote it.
I don't know.
That's fun, by the way. We're probably going to incorporate that, like getting on each other for things that we have written. Yeah. Like that's kind of funny. I mean, we won't enjoy it, but I'm pretty sure people listening will enjoy us ripping on ourselves for things.
The comment section doesn't let us forget. So who did we say was more clutch? Daniel Descalso, more clutch than Giancarlo Stanton.
I don't want to talk. It was technically true.
Yes, I know. No one cares about. And you know what is worse? That I've never thrown you under the bus until right now. You assigned that article to me at the time. That was like when you were like, "Here's what I need you to write." I
probably found the stat and was like, "Oh, hey, write this up."
And I was like, "Okay." And then everyone was like, "You are the dumbest person in the world." And I was like, "No, but Brett, okay." So thanks for that. I haven't let that one down.
That's funny. Well, the shoe's on the other foot. Now, if you want to have me write something up, you can let me know.
There you go.
All right. Well, that is it.
Wrap it up, Brett.
Yeah. BN Cubs Podcast. Make sure you are following us wherever you get your podcasts. You should be able to find us on everything now, including YouTube, where you can watch us looking purty. Thank you, of course, to Ankin Law. They are our sponsors for this podcast. They make it happen. If you have legal needs, that is who you should be reaching out to. And we'll be back at you next week. And, we appreciate it. We got a lot of nice comments on the first one. So we appreciate it. And just please let us know if there's anything we could be doing differently, better, whatever. And we probably won't do it, but you can tell us anything you want. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Michael and to Addison, our producer. And you all take care.